before he could prove himself, Shedeur Sanders was erased, not through a cut, but through neglect. Instead of first-team reps, he was locked into scout team duty, performing for others' benefit, never his own. Practices became punishment, unflagged hits, no voice in the huddle, no development plan. And all of it happened under the direction of Kevin Stefanski, whose leadership is now under direct scrutiny. Now, if you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. Not for play calling, but for enabling what the NFL commissioner now labels a racially biased environment. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was systemic obstruction masquerading as coaching discretion. Goodell's response marks a breaking point. For the first time, the NFL is treating developmental marginalization as a form of misconduct. Shedeur's case exposes the quiet ways a system can stunt a black quarterback's growth, then blame the player for the results. The league's decision to intervene here doesn't just protect one prospect. It redefines the boundaries of fairness in team operations across the sport. This wasn't just a sports story. This was a line in the sand, drawn not by a player, not by a coach, but by the NFL commissioner himself. When Roger Goodell publicly called out the Cleveland Browns for their treatment of rookie quarterback Shedeur Sanders, he wasn't just making a statement. He was rewriting the rules of what league oversight even means. And he didn't do it softly. He didn't hedge. He didn't suggest we could all do better. He used a phrase-coordinated campaign of hatred, a choice of words so deliberate, so loaded, it left no room for interpretation. Not bias, not misunderstanding. Hatred, that word escalated this issue from a football dispute to an institutional crisis. And it all revolved around one quarterback who, despite being one of the most highly touted prospects of his class, was denied even the most basic tools for success. Shedeur Sanders, son of Deion Sanders, walked into the NFL with expectations and pedigree. But in Cleveland, he was treated like a throwaway. Not only was he denied first-team reps, he was entirely relegated to scout team duty. That's not development. That's containment. The scout team isn't where chemistry is built. It's not where young quarterbacks read defenses or lead a huddle. It's where backups simulate the opponent's offense so starters can prep for Sunday. It's essentially football cosplay. By sticking Sanders there full-time, the Browns stripped him of every core leadership opportunity. He wasn't learning the system. He wasn't building trust with teammates. He wasn't gaining experience. He was being iced out under the guise of development. And while that would be bad enough on its own, reports from inside practice revealed something far more dangerous. Defenders were repeatedly delivering unflagged, excessive hits on Sanders. Not once, not twice, a pattern. And it was happening with coaches and officials standing right there, doing nothing. No whistles, no flags, no protection. What does it say when a rookie quarterback is treated like cannon fodder during practice, and the coaching staff doesn't intervene? What kind of message does that send to the team? To the player? To the league? It says this isn't about football anymore. It's about erasure. And it didn't stop on the field. Outside the locker room, local media was busy running their own campaign, one that didn't just critique Sanders' play because, again, he hadn't played yet, but instead targeted him personally. Cleveland-based journalists Tony Grossi, Mary Kay Kitt, and Jason Lloyd were named directly by Goodell for engaging in predatory, racially coded coverage, mocking injury reports, amplifying traffic tickets, pushing for his release before he'd taken a single regular season snap. This wasn't evaluation. This was demolition. These aren't rookie mistakes. These are coordinated narratives. And for the first time in league history, a commissioner treated media framing as a legitimate source of career harm, one that warrants public accountability. Not just because it's unfair, but because it actively undermines the league's stated values of inclusion, fairness, and opportunity. Goodell's intervention didn't come with polite suggestions or symbolic gestures. It came with consequences. Kevin Stefanski's job, as of that statement, is on the line, not because of losses or scandals, but because of the environment he allowed to form, one where a black quarterback was systemically denied development, physically endangered in practice, and left vulnerable to media narratives designed to undermine his legitimacy. That's a new standard. Never before has the NFL considered the behind-the-scenes mechanics of coaching as grounds for disciplinary action. This isn't about Sunday scores or fourth down calls. This is about intent, about pattern, about who gets to grow and who gets boxed out without ever being given a real chance. And that's what makes this such a turning point. Because for years, "he's not ready" has been the go-to excuse. The catch-all phrase used to justify keeping a young quarterback on the bench, out of reps, out of rhythm, out of leadership roles. But what happens when that excuse is contradicted by rep logs, by practice film, by injury reports, by fan observation? It starts to look less like coaching discretion and more like institutional bias. Shedeur Sanders' case makes that painfully clear. And what's worse, what makes this sting even deeper, is knowing that the only reason we're talking about this is because of who he is, his legacy, his name, his visibility. Because if this can happen to him, with all of that in his corner, what's been happening to the less visible rookies? The black quarterbacks who don't come from a famous lineage, who don't have the media spotlight, who just get quietly shuffled out the door after a year or two of, "he wasn't the right fit." How many of them were buried by the same system, without anyone stepping in? That's the crisis Goodell is staring down now. This is no longer about whether Shedeur was mistreated. That's been proven. The question now is whether the league's supposed values are real or just marketing. Are equity and fairness enforceable, or are they just slogan for commercials? This incident ripped the curtain down. It exposed how structural racism in the NFL often doesn't look like slurs or scandals. It looks like practice schedules, like media spin, like safety protocols that apply to some players and not to others. It's bureaucratic, it's procedural, and it hides behind language like system fit, coach's decision, or not quite ready. But when you pull the data, when you watch the footage, when you hear the silence after repeated cheap shots go unflagged, it stops looking like coaching and starts looking like sabotage. That's why this hit a nerve with fans. While the media pushed one version of the story, the public wasn't buying it. Social media lit up with support for Sanders. Fans called out the hypocrisy. Former players raised the alarm. And through it all, grassroots sentiment stayed consistent. This isn't about talent. It's about who the system believes deserves a shot. And that gap between media narrative and public perception, it's no longer just a PR problem. It's a business risk. Because fans aren't passive anymore. They're tuned in. They track reps. They question press coverage. And when the framing doesn't match the facts, they push back loudly. That's part of what made Goodell's move possible. The league saw that fan awareness had outpaced the media narrative. And if the NFL wanted to maintain credibility with its audience, it couldn't stay silent. Not this time. So now, the question becomes, what happens next? If Stefanski is removed, it'll set a precedent that stretches far beyond Cleveland. It'll mean that coaching decisions aren't just internal matters. They're subject to ethical review, that developmental protocols matter just as much as game day decisions. That systemic mistreatment, especially when it falls along racial lines, isn't just unfortunate. It's grounds for action. And that would change everything. Because every coach in the league would have to take a second look at how they're managing talent. Every front office would have to consider whether their internal culture matches the league's stated values. And every media outlet would have to reckon with the fact that their coverage isn't just background noise. It actively shapes careers. And for Shedeur Sanders, the damage was real. But so is the impact of what came next. He may have been locked out of his chance in Cleveland. But in being at the center of this reckoning, he forced the league to finally confront what's been broken for years. And if this intervention leads to lasting change, if future players are given real development, real protection, and real opportunity, then his story won't just be one of sabotage. It'll be one of disruption, and maybe even reform. If you're following this story and want to keep the pressure on, drop a comment. Let us know where you stand. Should more coaches be held accountable like this? Should media figures face consequences when they cross the line? And what does this say about where the NFL goes from here? Hit that like button if you're tired of performative statements and want actual change. Share this if you think more people need to understand how deep this goes. And subscribe if you want to keep exposing what's really happening behind the curtain. Because this isn't just about one player. It's about a system finally being forced to answer for itself. And this system has gotten away with far too much for far too long. What happened to Shedeur Sanders didn't begin with a bad practice schedule or a negative article. It began the moment people in power decided he didn't fit. Not the scheme, not the plan, not the image. And instead of addressing that bias head-on, they buried it behind bureaucracy. They told us it was about development, about experience, about process. But when you break it down, when you see a player locked out of first-team reps, physically in danger in practice, mocked by the local press, and framed as a liability before he even played a down, it's impossible to pretend this was ever just about football. That's why the league's intervention mattered. Because it wasn't just the fact that Stefanski made poor decisions. It was that his poor decisions fit into a larger pattern. A pattern where black quarterbacks are scrutinized harder, developed slower, protected less, and criticized more, regardless of talent. The NFL has a long history with this pattern. Quarterbacks like Lamar Jackson, Justin Fields, and Jalen Hurts didn't just prove people wrong. They had to. They were drafted with questions already loaded against them. Can he process the game? Is he accurate enough? Can he be a pocket passer? These weren't analytical concerns. They were coded messages, dressed up in scouting language, and they echo louder when the player is black. So when Shedeur Sanders, one of the most promising quarterback prospects, was thrown into a situation designed to stun his progress, and then publicly ridiculed for not flourishing, Roger Goodell stepped in, and not with a vague gesture, with a name, with a quote, with a direct warning. He called it a coordinated campaign of hatred. That doesn't happen in this league. The commissioner doesn't go there unless the situation is unignorable. But in this case, the evidence left no wiggle room. The structure that was supposed to help Shedeur become a professional quarterback had instead turned into a machine built to break him. Scout team isolation, no leadership roles, no developmental opportunities, cheap shots in practice, no protection, negative press coverage, call for release, and no regular season reps to speak of. That's not unfortunate. That's systemic. And now that it's been exposed, every executive in the league is watching how this plays out. Because if the NFL does remove Stefanski or even disciplines him in any public way, it will be the first time a coach is held accountable for how he develops talent, not just how he performs on Sundays. And it will be the first time that internal culture becomes part of a league-wide standard. No more, every coach has their own process. No more, he's just not ready. Not when the rep logs, medical evaluations, and practice footage show a clear disconnect between what's being said and what's actually happening. This is about accountability. And that accountability doesn't stop with coaching. Goodell's decision to name journalists Tony Grossi, Mary Kay Kitt, and Jason Lloyd was the other half of this unprecedented moment. It sent a message that the press is no longer beyond scrutiny, that media narratives don't exist in a vacuum. They shape perception, front office decision-making, and ultimately, player careers. For years, media outlets have enjoyed professional immunity while writing racially coded hit pieces. They've pushed players out of favor with fan bases. They've influenced how teams talk about their own quarterbacks. And they've rarely, if ever, been held to account. Until now, because when the commissioner includes your name in a public statement about systemic mistreatment, it's not business as usual anymore. It's a reckoning, one that says journalistic ethics in sports media aren't just a suggestion. They're now part of the larger conversation about equity and accountability. And that's long overdue. Because when journalists twist minor off-field moments, like traffic citations, into character judgments, or mock a player's injury as if it reflects something deeper, or openly campaign for his release before he even sees the field, it's not analysis. It's a smear job, and it has real consequences. Players don't operate in a bubble. When the media goes after them, it shapes how coaches treat them, how executives evaluate them, how fans see them, and ultimately, how long they last in the league. So Goodell's message wasn't just a defense of Shedeur Sanders. It was a warning shot. That framing matters. That media outlets don't get to play the just doing my job card when their work is part of a larger campaign to undermine a player's legitimacy. And again, this didn't start with Shedeur. His visibility just made it impossible to ignore. The question now is whether the NFL uses this moment as a turning point, or just another moment in a cycle of outrage and silence. Because this is about more than Cleveland, more than the Browns. This is about how many players have already been erased in the same way. How many black quarterbacks have been denied a real opportunity under the same logic, the same framing, the same structure, without the name recognition or public support to force change. Shedeur was high profile. He had a fan base. He had a legacy that helped keep his story alive. But what about the ones who didn't? What happens when bias operates quietly? When a player's career is derailed behind closed doors, masked as development discipline or team culture? What happens when there are no headlines, no commissioner statements, and no one with enough visibility to demand better? Those are the stories we'll never hear. And that's exactly why this one can't be allowed to fade. Because now, the NFL can no longer claim ignorance. It has the data, the footage, the public pushback, the media patterns, the player response. And most of all, it has an audience that's watching and won't let this be swept under the rug. The league's next move is everything. If Goodell follows through and holds Stefanski accountable, if he formalizes what was said in that statement, it will signal that development isn't just about systems and schemes. It's about fairness, safety, equity, and trust. It will tell every coach in the league that internal behavior matters just as much as external results, that they can no longer hide systemic bias behind jargon, and that "he's not ready" will no longer be accepted without evidence. And it will tell every journalist covering the league that their words aren't immune, that framing players unfairly, especially in ways that echo decades of racially biased tropes, can't just be brushed off as hot takes or opinion. This moment is a mirror for the league, for its leadership, for its media, and for the fans. And that's why the fan response has been so vital. Because when the people watching the games refuse to accept the spin, when they see through the narratives and call out the inconsistencies, they force institutions to change. Grassroots support is more than a vibe. It's a signal. It tells the NFL which way the wind is blowing. And this time, fans are clearly saying, we're not going to pretend this was just about football. That shift in audience expectation, that refusal to be gaslit by lazy coverage and bad faith excuses, is what's giving this moment power. It's what separates this from every other controversy that's come and gone without change. So now it's in the league's hands. Do they stand by their words? Do they make this more than a headline? Or do they let it fade, hoping the next scandal distracts everyone from what this really revealed? Because what was revealed can't be unseen. A young, black quarterback was brought into the league and immediately boxed out, sidelined, unprotected, unfairly targeted by media. And now, because fans refuse to look away, the NFL is facing a choice that will define how seriously it takes its own values. This is the moment where equity becomes either a policy or remains a slogan. This is where the NFL decides what kind of league it really wants to be. Because there's no middle ground left. Not after the commissioner steps up and says out loud that a young black quarterback was a target of a coordinated campaign of hatred. That's not corporate language. That's not a vague gesture toward improvement. That's a direct accusation, backed by facts, and it comes with weight, real weight. And it's not just about Shedeur Sanders anymore. It's about whether the NFL, a league that prides itself on the shield, on values like leadership, fairness, and opportunity, is finally willing to admit that some of its most harmful practices don't happen on game day. They happen behind the scenes. When you let a top prospect rot on the scout team with no first-team reps, you're not evaluating him. You're erasing him. When defenders hit him recklessly in practice, and coaches don't step in, you're not developing him. You're setting him up to fail. And when journalists cherry-pick minor personal moments and spin them into public character assassinations before the kid's ever thrown a single pass, well, now you're not just talking about football. You're actively shaping the reason he never gets a shot, and all of that is by design. That's why the commissioner's response hit like a shockwave, because instead of chalking it up to football decisions, he acknowledged that these aren't isolated mistakes. They're part of a pattern, and not just any pattern, a racially biased one. That reframing changes everything. It means intent matters, environment matters, Patterns of treatment matter. And when those patterns disproportionately affect black quarterbacks, players already fighting a break through a long and ugly history of exclusion, that's no longer just a personnel issue. That's a league issue. And Goodell said it himself. This wasn't about rules being broken. It was about a culture that let this happen without ever stopping to ask, why are we doing this? The answer, of course, is uncomfortable. Because it's not that Shedeur Sanders wasn't good enough. It's that some people in power never intended to give him the chance to be. That's the quiet part this league has been whispering for years. And now, finally, someone said it out loud. So, where does it go from here? If Kevin Stefanski stays in his role without accountability, it sends a message that all of this outrage, this reckoning, is just temporary. That you can sideline a quarterback, foster a toxic culture, ignore safety, and feed into racially biased narratives. And as long as you don't break a written rule, you'll be fine. But if the Browns make a move, if the league follows through and treats this with the gravity it deserves, it sets a new precedent. It says coaching isn't just about play calling. It's about ethics. It's about creating an environment where every player has a real chance, not just the ones who fit the system. Because that phrase, fit the system, has been used for decades to quietly push players out without ever saying why. And finally, someone's calling it what it really is. If you're still watching, hit that like button. Share this if you're done with vague excuses and want real change. Drop a comment. Should the NFL expand accountability beyond game day? Should media face scrutiny for how they frame players? And subscribe, because this story isn't going away. The system's been exposed. Now, let's see if the league has the guts to fix it.